The Black Maid was falsely accused of theft until the Mafia boss opened the security footage. The Black Maid, a kind-hearted woman who had worked in the luxurious estate of a Mafia boss for several years, was suddenly accused of theft. It all started during a lavish party that the Mafia boss had thrown at his grand mansion. The event was filled with wealthy guests, businessmen, and socialites. The air was thick with expensive perfumes, and the smell of exquisite food filled the grand hall. Yet, amidst all the luxury, one person's whisper stood out. "I can't believe she took it," a guest murmured, her voice filled with accusation. "She's just a maid. They always take something. I saw her near the desk earlier." Another voice chimed in. "It's always the help. She's been eyeing that diamond necklace for weeks." The maid, who had been quietly working in the background, organizing the drinks and assisting the guests, suddenly found herself at the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, and for the first time in years, she felt small and insignificant. She had always prided herself on her honesty and hard work. How could they accuse her of stealing? She was a woman of dignity, who worked tirelessly to support her family. But now, in front of everyone, she was being painted as a thief. The accusations continued to pile up, as more guests chimed in with their suspicions. "I saw her talking to the manager earlier," one guest said. "Maybe she was planning something. She's new to the house, isn't she? Maybe she thought no one would notice," another voice added. The maid's face flushed with shame, her mind racing for an explanation, but nothing came to mind. She had nothing to prove her innocence. She had never stolen anything in her life. As the whispers grew louder, the Mafia boss himself, Dominic Valentino, entered the room. The moment his dark eyes scanned the scene, the chatter died down. His reputation for being both ruthless and just was well known. He had built an empire with his sharp mind and cold demeanor. No one dared to cross him. But something was different about the way he looked at the maid. His gaze wasn't filled with judgment or suspicion. Instead, it was filled with curiosity. As the accusations continued, Dominic raised his hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he commanded, his voice steady, like the calm before a storm. "I want to see the security footage." The room fell into an eerie silence as everyone awaited his next move. With a few quick taps on his phone, the footage of the party began to play on the large screen in front of the room. Everyone watched in silence as the camera focused on the maid. She was simply moving through the room, cleaning and serving drinks, never once showing any sign of dishonesty. In fact, the footage showed her stopping to help a guest who had spilled wine on their dress, not once interacting with the jewelry or the expensive items in the room. Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the screen, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned to the crowd. "As you can see," he said coolly, "there is no evidence of theft. This woman is innocent. Those of you who accused her will answer for this mistake." The guests were left stunned, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The maid stood frozen, still in shock, but now filled with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in the night, she allowed herself to breathe. The tension in the room was palpable, but with the Mafia boss's intervention, she had been cleared of the false accusations. However, what Dominic did next would leave everyone speechless. The room remained in stunned silence after Dominic Valentino's declaration. The Mafia boss stood tall, his figure commanding the attention of everyone present. He was a man who rarely showed emotions, but there was something in his eyes now, something different. The maid, still trembling from the previous tension, stood by, unsure of what to do or say. She had always worked in the shadows, never expecting any form of acknowledgement. Now, with the eyes of the entire room on her, she felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before. But then, something unexpected happened. Dominic's voice broke the silence. "You." His finger pointed directly at her, making her heart race again. She froze, feeling a sudden rush of panic. Had he changed his mind? Was he going to punish her for causing a scene in front of his guests? But instead of reprimanding her, he simply nodded to one of his men. "Take her to my office." The command was clear, and, without a word, two of his bodyguards approached her. They guided her through the lavish hallways of the mansion, their silence making her feel more out of place than ever. She had worked here for years, yet she had never stepped foot inside Dominic's private office. The mansion was like a fortress, and she was just a small part of it. When they reached the door, one of the bodyguards knocked twice before opening it. The room inside was just as luxurious as everything else in the mansion. Leather chairs, polished wood desks, and a massive window with a view of the city skyline. Dominic was already sitting at the desk, his posture as commanding as ever. The bodyguards left the room, closing the door quietly behind them, leaving the two of them alone. She stood there, uncertain, as Dominic gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down, her heart pounding in her chest. Dominic looked at her intently, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he finally said, his voice softer than she had expected. "No one should be treated like that, especially not by people who don't know the truth." She looked up at him, surprised by his words. Was this the same man who ruled over so many with an iron fist? The same man who everyone feared? She didn't know how to respond. She had always kept her distance from him, maintaining a professional relationship. He was her employer, and she was just a maid. But now, he was treating her with a level of respect she had never imagined from someone like him. I didn't steal anything," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "I swear. I've worked here for so long, and I've never taken anything that wasn't mine." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "I know. That's why I'm going to make sure this doesn't go any further. But I need you to understand something." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. "In this world, people will accuse you of things you didn't do. They will try to tear you down, but it's how you handle it that matters. You're stronger than they think." She swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. For the first time, she realized that Dominic Valentino wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a man who understood power, but he also understood injustice. And right now, he was offering her a chance to stand up for herself in a way she never thought possible. "You're not alone," he continued, his voice steady. "I will make sure those who falsely accused you face the consequences. But I also want you to know that this isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning." She looked at him, still unsure of what he meant, but something in his tone made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a chance for her to finally be seen and heard, not just as the maid, but as someone who deserved respect and dignity. The room was quiet for a few moments, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She didn't know what to say, but the gratitude she felt was overwhelming. Dominic broke the silence. "Go home for the night. Get some rest. We'll handle everything from here. You've earned that much." She nodded, standing up from the chair, still in disbelief. As she walked toward the door, she turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her eyes brimming with emotion. Dominic gave a small, reassuring smile. "You're welcome. Now go. I'll see you tomorrow." She left the room, the heavy door closing behind her. As she made her way down the hallway, she couldn't help but feel like something had changed. She had been given a chance for justice, for fairness. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to change her life forever. The next morning, she woke up to a strange mix of emotions. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to rush through her morning routine, nervous about getting to work on time, worrying about the judgment she would face from her colleagues and the guests at the mansion. It was a Saturday, a day off for her. As she sat up in her modest apartment, she stared out the window, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, and thought about what had happened the night before. Dominic Valentino had given her a chance, a rare opportunity to be seen for who she truly was, not just as the help. It was a feeling she couldn't shake. She was still in disbelief. No one in her life had ever offered her such kindness before, let alone a powerful man like him. Despite the obvious wealth and danger that surrounded him, he had treated her with dignity, and for that, she would be forever grateful. But her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She got up, quickly opening it, only to find a man in a sharp suit standing in the hallway. He had the look of someone who belonged in the shadows, and for a moment, she felt a jolt of panic. "Are you Ms. Carter?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Valentino," he said. "He sent me to escort you to the mansion. We have some business to discuss." Confusion swept over her, but before she could say anything, the man stepped aside, revealing a sleek black car parked just outside her building. The driver, wearing a dark suit, opened the door for her. "Please, Ms. Carter," the man said, nodding toward the car. Mr. Valentino is expecting you. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the car. What could this mean? Why was Dominic sending someone to fetch her? The car ride felt long, each passing minute making her more anxious. When they finally arrived at the mansion, she was led inside without a word. The mansion was as grand as she remembered. Tall marble columns, vast hallways lined with priceless artwork, and rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly. She was escorted to the same office where she had spoken to Dominic the night before. The door opened, and she stepped inside. Dominic was standing by the window, looking out over the sprawling estate. His posture was still the same, tall, confident, and imposing. But there was something different about him today. As he turned to face her, he gave her a small smile, but it was a smile that held an air of seriousness behind it. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice steady and calm. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday." She nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. "You're probably wondering why I called you here today," he continued. "It's not just to clear your name, although that's part of it. It's because I believe you deserve more than what you've been given in this life. You've been a loyal and hard-working person, and I don't think you've ever been treated with the respect you deserve." She looked at him, stunned by his words. Could it be true? Was he actually acknowledging her worth? Dominic stepped forward, his gaze intense but not harsh. "I want to offer you a position in my organization, something that will allow you to rise above the role you've always been in. You'll have more responsibility, more power, and more respect. But it's a choice you have to make on your own." She stared at him, her mind racing. She had always worked in menial jobs, never imagining that she would be given such an opportunity. She had worked at this mansion for years, but had always been invisible, just a figure in the background. And now, here was this man, a powerful mafia boss, offering her a chance to be seen, to be more than just a maid. "I know it's a lot to take in," Dominic said, sensing her hesitation. "But think about it. You don't have to stay in the shadows anymore. You have a chance to prove to yourself and to everyone else that you're capable of much more than they ever imagined." She stood there, her mind spinning with the possibilities. What would this new life look like? What would it mean to have power, respect, and dignity in a world where she had always been overlooked? But just as quickly, doubt crept in. "I don't know if I can do this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been anything more than a maid." Dominic's eyes softened, and he stepped closer to her. "You've been more than that all along. You've just never been given the opportunity to show it." She looked at him, a mixture of hope and fear in her heart. Could she really take that step? Could she break free from the life she had known and become something else? Something more? Dominic's next words were simple but powerful. "The choice is yours, Ms. Carter. But if you decide to take it, I'll be here to help you every step of the way." The next few days passed in a blur. For her, she couldn't stop thinking about Dominic Valentino's offer. For years, she had been invisible to the world, a quiet presence in the background, carrying out the tasks expected of her without ever questioning the limits of her role. But now, Dominic had given her a choice, a chance to step out of the shadows and into a position of power. It was overwhelming, and part of her wanted to refuse, to stay in her safe, familiar place. But another part of her felt a spark of hope, a possibility that she could finally be more than what others had always seen her as. One afternoon, she was called into the mansion again. This time, when she arrived, Dominic was already waiting for her in his office. The room was the same as before, but today it felt different. There was an air of anticipation in the room, as if something important was about to happen. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his gaze intense, but welcoming. "I see you've thought about my offer," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. She nodded slowly, still unsure. "I have," she replied, her voice steady. "But I don't know if I can do it. It's a big step. I've never been more than a maid. What if I fail?" Dominic stood up and walked over to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let me tell you something, Ms. Carter. The only failure is not trying. You've been underestimated your entire life, but that doesn't mean you're not capable of greatness. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to step into a role where you're recognized for the strength and integrity you've always had." His words were like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She had always worked hard, never asking for anything in return, always invisible to the world around her. But now, Dominic was offering her a chance to be seen. "I understand if you're afraid," he continued. But fear is the price of growth. If you stay where you are, nothing will change. But if you take this opportunity, you'll be able to build something that's yours, something that you can be proud of. She looked at him, her heart racing. Could she really do this? Could she really step into a world of power and responsibility that had always seemed so far out of reach? She had no formal education, no connections, and certainly no experience in the world of business or power. But Dominic was offering her a chance to prove that she was more than just a maid, a chance to take control of her own future. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice filled with determination. Dominic smiled, a rare and genuine smile that softened his usually stoic face. "Good. I knew you would be." He walked over to a desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "This is your new role. You'll be working closely with me, and I'll teach you everything you need to know. You'll be part of my team, and I'll ensure that you have all the resources and support you need to succeed. But it won't be easy. It'll be a lot of hard work, and there will be challenges along the way." She took the folder from him, her hands trembling slightly. It was a symbol of everything she had ever wanted, a chance to change her life. She opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. It was all so official, so real. She was actually being given a new role, a new identity. She felt a rush of emotions, but most of all, she felt pride. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. "Thank you for believing in me." Dominic's gaze softened once more, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've always had it in you, Miss Carter. Now it's time to show the world what you're capable of." For the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly seen. She was no longer just a maid, a silent figure in the background. She was someone with potential, someone who could make a difference. As she left the office that day, holding the folder tightly in her hands, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time, she felt like she was walking towards something meaningful, something that was hers. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. The days that followed were unlike anything she had ever experienced. The weight of her decision to accept Dominic Valentino's offer began to sink in. She was no longer just a maid. She was stepping into a new world, a world that had always seemed so far beyond her reach. Dominic had given her the opportunity to prove herself, but now it was up to her to rise to the challenge. Her first few weeks in her new role were both exciting and overwhelming. She was assigned to work closely with Dominic's trusted advisors, learning the intricacies of the business world he controlled. From meetings with high-profile clients to overseeing operations in the family's various enterprises, she quickly realized how much she had to learn. But despite the steep learning curve, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was actively contributing, making decisions, and proving herself as a valuable member of the team. However, with each passing day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every decision she made, no matter how small, seemed to be scrutinized by the eyes of the people around her. And while Dominic had made it clear that he believed in her, there were others in the organization who were less certain. Whispers of doubt started to circulate, and she could feel the weight of those whispers pressing down on her. It wasn't long before she found herself at the center of a new challenge. One afternoon, as she was working late in the office, a phone call came through. It was a call she wasn't expecting, a call that would change everything. "Miss Carter, we need you to come to the warehouse. There's a situation that needs your attention," the voice on the other end of the line said. She didn't hesitate. Dominic had entrusted her with responsibilities, and she wasn't about to back down now. She grabbed her coat and left the office, determined to prove that she was capable of handling whatever was thrown her way. The drive to the warehouse was silent, the tension in the air thick as she tried to piece together what was happening. She knew the warehouse was where some of the family's more questionable dealings took place, but she had never been involved in any of it. What could possibly be so urgent? When she arrived, the scene that greeted her was chaotic. Several men were standing outside the entrance, their faces serious as they discussed something in hushed tones. One of them stepped forward to greet her. "Ms. Carter, we've got a problem," he said, his voice grave. "There's been a breach. Someone's trying to steal from us." Her heart raced. Steal from the family? This was serious. "What happened?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "We've got a shipment of high-value goods that's been marked for delivery," the man continued. "But when the shipment was unloaded, we found it was missing some items." Someone on the inside is responsible. The realization hit her like a wave. Someone had betrayed them. Someone she knew. Do you have any suspects? She asked, her voice tight. We've narrowed it down, he replied, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. But we need you to help us confirm who's behind it. We think it's one of the new guys. They're part of the team you've been working with. The blood drained from her face. She had been working closely with some of the new recruits, getting to know them, building trust. Could one of them be the person responsible? What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. We've got security footage from the warehouse, the man said. We need you to watch it and help us identify who's involved. She nodded, her mind racing as she followed him into the building. The footage was on a large screen in the back room, and as they watched it, her stomach dropped. The video clearly showed one of the new recruits slipping into the warehouse under the cover of darkness, removing items from the shipment and loading them into a vehicle. It was a direct betrayal, and it hit her harder than she expected. She had trusted this person, had given them the benefit of the doubt, and now they had crossed the line. She turned to the man beside her, her voice cold. We have to inform Dominic immediately. They made the call, and within minutes, Dominic arrived at the warehouse. He took in the situation, his expression unreadable. What's the verdict? He asked, his voice steady but with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. We have a traitor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. One of the new recruits. Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze focused. You did the right thing, he said. We'll take care of this. But remember, in this world, betrayal has consequences. No one is above the family. As he walked away, his men already moving to handle the situation, she stood there, the weight of everything she had just seen pressing down on her. This was the world she was now a part of, a world of power, loyalty, and unforgiving consequences. And as much as she had wanted to escape the shadows, she knew that stepping into the light came with its own set of dangers. But for better or worse, she had made her choice. And there was no turning back now. The aftermath of the betrayal hung over the warehouse like a dark cloud. She had never imagined she would find herself in the midst of such a storm. One of the recruits had stolen from the family, but the more pressing question lingered. How much trust could she place in the people around her now? Dominic had swiftly dealt with the traitor, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something else was brewing beneath the surface. The days that followed were tense. She found herself working even harder, trying to prove her worth to Dominic and to herself. Yet, with every step forward, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. Trust, once shattered, was hard to rebuild. She knew that now. Her role had shifted, and she wasn't sure if she was prepared for the responsibilities it brought. She was no longer just a bystander in this high-stakes world. She was part of it. One evening, after another grueling day of meetings and strategy sessions, Dominic called her into his office. He had been distant lately, focused on the business, and she hadn't had a chance to speak with him outside of work. When she entered, he was sitting at his desk, looking at a set of papers. As she stepped inside, he looked up and nodded for her to sit. How are you holding up? He asked, his tone softer than usual. She took a deep breath before responding. It's been difficult, she admitted. I'm not used to all of this, the pressure, the decisions. I feel like I'm in over my head. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. I understand, he said. This world is not for the faint of heart, but you've already proven you belong. Here, don't forget that. She nodded, but doubts still lingered in her mind. What happened with the recruit, the one who betrayed us? She asked, her voice low. Dominic's expression hardened, the shift in his demeanor immediate. He's taken care of, but betrayal has a way of making you question everything. I've had my fair share of it over the years. Trust is a fragile thing. You learn to be careful with who you give it to. She felt the weight of his words, knowing they were more than just about the recruit. Do you ever regret being in this business? She asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Dominic was quiet for a moment before answering. Regret is for those who can't live with their choices. I don't have time for that. What I've built is mine, but it doesn't come without cost. She looked at him, searching his face for something more, but his expression remained unreadable. I understand, she said, although in that moment, she wasn't sure she did. The Mafia world was a constant balancing act between power, loyalty, and survival. And now, she was a part of it. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the days passed, she threw herself into her work, determined to prove she was more than just a maid who had been given an opportunity. She had earned her place, and she would fight to keep it. But her growing sense of purpose was complicated by the growing tension between her and some of the others in the organization. Not everyone was as welcoming as Dominic had been. There were whispers, glances exchanged in the hallways when she wasn't looking, and a lingering sense that she was still an outsider. It was late one evening when the next challenge came. She was in the office alone, going through some documents, when the phone rang. She picked it up, her heart already beating faster from the late hour. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end said, "we need you to come to the club. There's been an incident." Her stomach dropped. The club was one of the family's front businesses, and it was always a place of high tension. "What happened?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's been a dispute," the voice replied. "Some of the new recruits are involved. We need you to mediate." Mediate? She was still getting used to the idea that she had any authority, let alone enough to mediate a dispute among the family's men. But Dominic had placed his trust in her, and she wouldn't back down now. She grabbed her coat and rushed to the club, her mind racing. When she arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Two men, both new recruits, were standing face to face, shouting at each other. The argument was escalating, and it seemed like any moment could turn violent. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Enough," she commanded, surprising even herself with the authority in her tone. Both men stopped and turned to face her, their expressions one of surprise and confusion. "This is not the way," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever the issue is, it can be solved without violence. We are a family. We don't tear each other apart." There was a long pause, and for a moment, she wondered if they would listen. But then, one of the men lowered his gaze. "You're right," he muttered, stepping back. The other followed suit, and just like that, the conflict was defused. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands still trembling slightly. It had been a test, and she had passed. When she returned to the office later that night, Dominic was waiting for her. "I heard about the incident at the club," he said, his voice neutral but approving. "Well done." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm learning," she said, though she still felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing between the life she had left behind and the new world she was now a part of. Dominic's gaze softened. "Keep proving yourself, and you'll belong here. I promise you that." She nodded, knowing that she still had a long way to go, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the path to something greater. A few weeks had passed since the incident at the club, and things were beginning to settle into a new routine for her. The world she had entered was still intimidating, but she had earned a place for herself within Dominic's operation. Her confidence had grown, but there was always a nagging feeling that she was still being tested. Dominic had been distant lately, wrapped up in his affairs, but she noticed the way his eyes would sometimes linger on her when she made decisions, like he was waiting for her to slip up. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or if he was truly watching her every move. One evening, Dominic called her into his office again. She entered with a mix of anticipation and nerves. This time, it was different. There was an air of finality in the way he looked at her. "Close the door," he said, his voice firm. She did as he asked and took a seat across from him, her heart pounding. "You've been doing well," Dominic began, his eyes studying her intently. "Better than most would in your position. But there's something important we need to address." She held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "There are factions within the organization," he said, leaning forward slightly. "People who are loyal, but also people who are discontent. There are those who have been trying to undermine me, trying to take control. And I need someone I can trust to make sure these problems don't spread. Someone who's not afraid to take action when necessary." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had always been on the sidelines, working quietly, staying out of the way. But now, it seemed like Dominic wanted her to step into a role that she wasn't sure she was ready for. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice steady. Dominic's gaze never left hers. "I need you to oversee the people who've been causing trouble. Watch them closely. See who's loyal, and see who's just waiting for the right moment to betray me." Her heart skipped a beat. This was more than she had ever signed up for. She wasn't sure if she was ready to play the role of a spy, to be the one who uncovered the lies and deceit that might be lurking in the shadows. I understand, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she did. I'll do what needs to be done. Dominic gave a slight nod, as if he had been expecting this answer. Good. I trust you. With that, he dismissed her. As she left his office, she felt the weight of the responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. It wasn't just about doing her job anymore. She was being asked to protect the family, to guard against the very people she had worked alongside every day. The next few weeks became a blur of meetings, quiet observations, and constant tension. She watched, listened, and waited. Her role had shifted again. Now, she was the one in the shadows, gathering information, watching people who had once been her colleagues. She never showed any sign of suspicion, keeping her interactions normal, but she was always on alert. One evening, as she was leaving the office, one of the new recruits, a young man who had been under her watch, approached her. His face was tense, and his eyes darted around nervously. Ms. Carter, he said in a low voice, I need to talk to you. It's about Dominic. Her heart raced, but she kept her composure. What about him? She asked, keeping her voice calm. The young man glanced around again, making sure no one was watching. I've heard things, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Things about what he's planning. Things that could change everything. She felt a chill run down her spine. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. Information. But was it true? Was this just another attempt to undermine Dominic? What kind of things? She asked, her voice betraying none of her curiosity. The young man hesitated, clearly unsure of how much to reveal. I can't say everything, he murmured. But there's talk about a shift in leadership. A power struggle. People are getting restless. She leaned in closer, her instincts telling her to be cautious. Who's behind it? She asked, her voice sharp. He shook his head. I don't know yet. But people are gathering support. It's just a matter of time before it all comes to a head. She looked at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. I need more than just rumors, she said firmly. If you want my help, you need to give me names. Proof. The young man swallowed hard. I don't have names, but I know where to find the people who do. They meet in the old warehouse on the edge of the property. Late at night. She nodded slowly, her mind already working through the possibilities. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. She had the lead she needed. Go back. To your post, she said. Don't say anything more. I'll take it from here. As the young man walked away, she felt a surge of determination. She knew that this could be the moment that changed everything. If she could uncover the truth, she could secure her place in Dominic's world once and for all. But if she was wrong, everything could come crashing down. This was the risk she had chosen to take, and there was no turning back now. That night, she stood at the edge of the old warehouse, the chill of the evening air biting into her skin. The place was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of the city and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Her heart raced as she stepped forward, every instinct telling her that tonight would be the night that everything would change. The young recruit had told her about the secret meeting, about the power struggle brewing in the shadows of Dominic's organization. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that this was her chance to prove herself. She had worked her way up, earned Dominic's trust, and now, she was about to uncover the truth. She checked her watch, then scanned the area around her. The warehouse was located at the edge of the property, a secluded spot away from the main house. It was the perfect place for secret meetings, far enough from the eyes of the rest of the family. She slowly approached the entrance, the heavy door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The dim light cast long shadows on the walls, and there were figures gathered in the center of the room, speaking in low voices. She could hear snippets of their conversation as she stepped further inside. We can't keep waiting like this, one voice said, the tone impatient. The time to act is now. Another voice replied, more measured. We need to be careful. If we make a move too soon, we'll expose ourselves. Dominic's not someone you want to cross. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. This was it. These were the people who had been plotting against Dominic, the ones who had been stirring up unrest within the family. She needed to gather information, but she couldn't afford to get too close. She quietly moved to the side, finding a spot in the shadows where she could listen without being noticed. She held her breath as the conversation continued. We need to get him out of the picture, one of the men said, his voice cold. Once he's gone, we take control. This organization will be ours. The words hit her like a slap to the face. They were planning to overthrow Dominic, to take everything he had built and destroy him in the process. She had always known the Mafia was a dangerous world, but hearing it spoken so openly sent a chill down her spine. She was no longer just a bystander. She was part of this, and now, she had to make a choice. As she stood there, hidden in the shadows, she felt the weight of the situation settle on her shoulders. She had come here to gather information, but now, she was faced with the reality of the betrayal. These people were not just traitors, they were a threat to everything Dominic had worked for. And if she didn't act, everything could fall apart. Her pulse quickened as she listened more closely, trying to gather as many details as she could. They were talking about their plan, how they intended to move against Dominic, and what they would do once they had control. She memorized every word, every detail. This was her chance to prove her loyalty. She couldn't let Dominic lose everything, especially not now, after everything he had done for her. But just as she was about to turn and leave to report what she had heard, one of the men shifted his position, coming dangerously close to where she stood. Her heart skipped a beat as she held her breath, praying she wouldn't be noticed. She backed up slowly, her every movement careful and deliberate. Fortunately, the man didn't see her, and he moved away, his attention back on the conversation. She let out a quiet sigh of relief and stepped back toward the door, still trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. But just as she was about to slip out, she heard a voice call out, "You." She froze, her blood running cold. She turned slowly, her mind racing. It was one of the men, the one who had spoken about taking control. He was looking directly at her now, his gaze sharp and calculating. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her composure. She started, but the words caught in her throat. There was no way out now. She couldn't lie. Not to him, not to any of them. The tension in the room thickened as all eyes turned to her. The weight of their gaze felt like a physical force, and she realized just how deeply she had stepped into this dangerous world. But before she could respond, the man's expression changed. A slow smile crept onto his face. "You're the one working with Dominic, aren't you?" he asked, his tone shifting from suspicion to something else, something darker. "I've heard about you. You've got a lot of guts to be here." She didn't answer, not trusting her voice to hold steady. The man took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "We don't take kindly to people spying on us," he said softly, his smile widening. "But I think you already knew that." She stood her ground, trying not to let the fear show on her face. She had made it this far. She couldn't let him break her now. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Enough." Dominic's voice echoed through the warehouse, cold and commanding. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. The man turned, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Mr. Valentino," he said, his voice now deferential. Dominic's eyes flicked toward her, his gaze hard. But there was something else there too, something she couldn't quite place. "I think it's time we ended this little meeting," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. The men exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to argue. Slowly, they began to disperse, the tension easing, but not without leaving an aftertaste of danger in the air. Dominic walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said, his voice low. She followed him silently, her mind still reeling from the confrontation. She had made it out of the situation, but she knew this was far from over. Dominic was the one who had saved her, but now she had a bigger role to play than she ever imagined. The game had changed, and so had she. After Dominic stepped into the warehouse and ended the tense confrontation, he led her outside, his stride purposeful. The cold night air hit her face as they walked toward the car, but the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily on her chest. She had almost been caught, her presence exposed, and yet Dominic had intervened at the last moment. His timing was always perfect, and she couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and fear. When they reached the car, Dominic turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You did well tonight," he said, his voice low and calm. "But you need to understand something. You're deeper into this than you realize." She nodded, unsure of how to respond. The gravity of his words hit her, but she didn't want to show how rattled she truly was. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her mind. Dominic studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You're doing more than that. You're proving yourself," he said. "But you're walking a fine line, and the further you go, the more dangerous it becomes. I need you to be prepared for what's coming next." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had known the stakes were high, but she hadn't fully understood what it meant to be so deeply involved in the inner workings of Dominic's world. She wasn't just helping him anymore. She was becoming part of the family's power structure. As they drove back to the mansion, the weight of his words echoed in her mind. She had always lived on the outside, but now she was stepping into the very heart of the organization. And that came with its own set of risks. Over the next few days, she continued her work with Dominic's team, keeping a watchful eye on the recruits, monitoring any signs of rebellion or discontent. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the pressure felt suffocating, when she wondered if she had made the right choice by stepping into this world. But whenever doubt crept in, she would think back to the moment when Dominic had trusted her, when he had given her the opportunity to prove herself. That trust fueled her determination. One evening, as she sat in the office, going over some reports, a message came through on her phone. It was from Dominic. "Meet me in my office. We need to discuss the next steps." Her heart raced as she stood up, her mind immediately jumping to conclusions. What had happened now? What was coming next? When she entered his office, Dominic was already seated behind his desk, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression serious but not unkind. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of him. She took a seat, her mind racing. "We've been monitoring the situation," he began, his voice steady. "The rebels are getting bolder. We've gathered enough information to know who's behind it, but there's a problem. Some of our most trusted people have been compromised." She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled members. It was about betrayal from within. "Who's involved?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "There are people in this family who are playing both sides. They've been feeding information to the rebels, helping them organize. It's time to take action, but I need someone I can trust to handle it." She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew this was the moment when everything would change. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was going to have to make hard choices. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Dominic's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I need you to get close to the people who've been leaking information. Find out who the traitors are. Get them to talk, and then bring them to me." She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been preparing for this moment, but the reality of it felt overwhelming. She had trusted some of these people, worked with them day in and day out. But now, she was being asked to betray that trust in order to protect the family. It was a line she had never imagined crossing. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Dominic gave her a small nod of approval. "I know you will. But remember, this is a dangerous game. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back." As she left the office, the weight of his words pressed down on her. She was walking a fine line, and one wrong move could cost her everything. But she had made her choice. She was no longer just the maid. She was part of this world, and she would do whatever it took to survive. The next few days were a blur of quiet observation, gathering information, and preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. She kept her interactions casual, not letting anyone suspect that she was onto them. But inside, she was building the courage to do what was necessary. She wasn't just working for Dominic anymore. She was working to protect everything they had built, and that meant taking risks, even if it meant betraying people she had once trusted. It was the only way to survive in this world. And she was ready. The tension in the air had become unbearable. Days had passed since Dominic had given her the task of rooting out the traitors within the organization. She had watched, listened, and observed everyone closely, noting every small movement, every subtle change in behavior. But now, the moment had come. The leaks were becoming more obvious. She had gathered enough evidence to know who was behind the treachery, but the time to act was drawing near. She sat in her office late one evening, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across her papers. Her mind raced with the information she had uncovered. There were two men who had been at the center of the conspiracy, both trusted members of the family, both people she had worked alongside every day. It It was a betrayal that cut deeper than she had expected. She couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a world where trust was fleeting and loyalty was nothing more than a game. But now she had to face the reality of her position. She was no longer just a maid. She was an integral part of this operation, and it was her job to protect Dominic and his empire. The task ahead of her was clear. She had to confront these men, expose their betrayal, and bring them to Dominic. She wasn't sure how it would go, but she knew that there was no other choice. The next morning, she met Dominic in his office. He was looking over some papers when she entered, his usual calm demeanor in place. But today, there was an edge to him, something she hadn't noticed before. "You've been quiet lately," he said, not looking up from his papers. "What have you found?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I've found the traitors," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Dominic looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice low and cold. "Jonas and Mark," she replied, the names feeling heavy on her tongue. "They've been leaking information to the rebels, organizing in secret." Dominic's face darkened. "I suspected as much," he said, his tone calm, but with an underlying anger that was unmistakable. "What do you want to do about it?" She hesitated for a moment, but then she made her decision. "I'll confront them," she said. "I'll get them to confess, and I'll bring them to you." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I trust you," he said simply. "But remember, if you fail, there will be consequences." She nodded in return, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. She knew what was at stake. She had already seen how ruthless this world could be, and if she didn't act quickly and decisively, everything could fall apart. That night, she arranged a meeting with Jonas and Mark at a secluded location. She had carefully planned every detail, ensuring that no one would be able to overhear their conversation. As she arrived at the meeting spot, her heart was pounding in her chest. She had done this 100 times before, met with men she knew, men she had trusted, but tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was someone with power, someone with a mission. As Jonas and Mark arrived, they greeted her as they always had, with casual smiles and friendly words. But there was something in their eyes, something that made her stomach churn. They didn't know that she knew the truth. She led them into a darkened room, where the conversation would take place. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady but firm. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the two men said nothing. Then, Jonas spoke. "What are you talking about?" His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension in it. Mark glanced at him, then at her, but said nothing. "I know. You've been leaking information to the rebels," she said. "I know you've been plotting against Dominic." For a moment, there was silence. Jonas stepped closer to her, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "We've done nothing wrong." She didn't back down. "I have proof," she said, her voice unyielding. "I've been watching you, listening to your conversations. I've seen the way you've been working behind Dominic's back." Mark's face hardened. "You've got it all wrong," he said. "We're just trying to protect our own interests. This is bigger than you think." She shook her head. "No, it's not bigger than Dominic. It's bigger than both of you, and you're playing a dangerous game." The confrontation was tense, the air thick with distrust. She knew what they were capable of, and she had to be careful not to let them sense any weakness. "I'm not here to fight you," she said. "I'm here to give you one chance. Admit what you've done, and come clean to Dominic. He'll decide your fate." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, Jonas finally spoke. "You think you have power over us?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a maid. You don't belong here." The words stung, but she held her ground. "I'm more than just a maid," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm someone who's willing to do whatever it takes to protect Dominic's family. And that means exposing you for the traitors you are." The two men exchanged a look, and for a moment, it seemed like they were considering their options. Then, without warning, Jonas lunged at her, a look of fury in his eyes. She stepped back, her heart racing, but before anything could escalate, she pulled out her phone and sent the signal to Dominic's men. Within seconds, the door to the room burst open, and Dominic's men flooded in, grabbing Jonas and Mark before they could make another move. The two men were quickly restrained, and Dominic appeared in the doorway, his expression cold as he took in the scene. "Take them away," he said, his voice low and final. As they were escorted out of the room, she turned to Dominic, her heart still pounding. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic nodded, his gaze softening just slightly. "You did well," he said, the approval in his voice evident. But the weight of the situation was far from over. The betrayal had been exposed, but there was more to come. The family was fractured, and it would take more than one victory to restore order. But for the first time, she felt like she was truly a part of something bigger. She had earned her place, and she was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the confrontation in the warehouse was still fresh in her mind as she walked through the mansion's corridors the next day. The weight of the situation had settled on her like a heavy coat she couldn't remove. Jonas and Mark were gone, their betrayal exposed for all to see. Yet, despite the small victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play, that this was only the beginning of something much larger. Dominic had been distant after the arrest. He had thanked her for her work, but there was no warmth in his words. She understood. In this world, gratitude was rare, and loyalty was even rarer. It wasn't about personal relationships. It was about power, control, and survival. She couldn't afford to forget that. As the days passed, she focused on her role, working diligently to ensure the stability of the family's operations. But no matter how much she tried to immerse herself in the work, she couldn't ignore the tension that had begun to rise between her and the others. They were watching her, the other members of the family, the ones who had once accepted her as one of their own. Now, she was seen differently. The whispers were subtle but persistent, as if they were always just out of reach, just beyond her hearing. She was no longer the quiet maid who kept to herself. She was a player in a game of power, and that changed everything. But despite all of this, she kept her head down, working hard, staying focused on what mattered, securing her place, proving herself worthy of Dominic's trust. Then, one afternoon, just as she was preparing to leave the office for the day, she received a message from Dominic. "Meet me in my office. We need to talk." The words were brief, but carried the weight of something important. Her stomach dropped. Was it another test? Another dangerous mission? Or something else entirely? She didn't know, but she wasn't going to back down now. She had come too far. When she entered Dominic's office, he was standing by the window, looking out at the skyline, his posture as imposing as ever. He turned as she walked in, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Close the door," he said, his voice low. She obeyed, closing the door softly behind her. The room was quiet except for the sound of her breathing and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. "You've done well, but we're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice steady, almost businesslike. "The rebels are getting more organized. There's still a threat looming over us. I need you to step up again, and this time, it's going to be harder." She nodded, her heart beating faster. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Dominic turned toward her, his gaze intense. "I need you to go deeper," he said. "You've been watching the recruits, but there's more to this. There's someone higher up in the organization who's feeding information to the rebels. I need you to find out who it is." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone within the inner circle? A trusted member of the family? She had already exposed one traitor, but this was a much bigger challenge. "How do you want me to find them?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm as possible. Dominic's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You've already proven that you know how to handle delicate situations," he said. "You'll have to be careful. This person is good at covering their tracks. I'm counting on you to get close, gain their trust, and uncover the truth." She nodded, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was her world now, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. "I'll do it," she said, her voice unwavering. Dominic gave a small nod. "I know you will. But be careful. This is the final test. Fail, and it could cost you everything." His words sent a chill down her spine. She had already risked so much, but now the stakes were higher than ever. She was being asked to expose the very people who had once trusted her, the people who had helped her rise to where she was now. But there was no turning back. She couldn't let the family, especially Dominic, fall apart. As she left Dominic's office, her mind raced. Who could it be? Who in the family could be working with the rebels? She thought back to everything she had learned, every conversation she had overheard, every subtle shift in behavior. There had to be something she had missed, a clue that would lead her to the betrayer. For the next few days, she observed everyone even more closely. She spent hours watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to strike. It was exhausting, and the pressure of it all was beginning to weigh on her. But she had no choice. She had to find the traitor, or everything she had worked for would be lost. Then, one night, she finally caught a break. She overheard a conversation between two high-ranking members of the family, a conversation that made her blood run cold. They were talking about the rebels, but the way they spoke, so casually, so confidently, made it clear that they were involved. She couldn't hear everything, but enough of it was clear. They were planning something big, something that could bring Dominic down. She couldn't waste any more time. She had to act, and she had to act fast. The trap was set, and the game was about to begin. The days following her discovery about the traitors were filled with anticipation and unease. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard, the conversation between the high-ranking members of the family and the rebels. It was clear now, the betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. It wasn't just a couple of disgruntled individuals. It was a well-coordinated effort, one that threatened to bring Dominic down. She had to act fast. Dominic had trusted her with this mission, but now it felt as if the walls were closing in. The pressure was immense, and she knew that one wrong move could mean the end of everything. As she walked through the mansion's quiet halls late that evening, her mind raced. Who were these people? Who could she trust? And who was secretly working against them? She had spent so much time watching others, trying to gather information, that she had barely noticed how isolated she had become. It was clear now that the more she learned, the more alone she felt. The weight of her position was heavier than she had expected. The quiet hum of the mansion's lights was the only sound that accompanied her thoughts. She entered her room, locking the door behind her. She wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. With everything hanging in the balance, she knew the only way to survive was to outsmart those who were plotting against Dominic. As she sat at her desk, reviewing the evidence she had collected, a small knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her pulse quickened. Who could it be? She stood, moved silently across the room, and opened the door just a crack. Standing there was someone she hadn't expected. Matteo, one of Dominic's most trusted men. He was the type of person who never spoke unless it was absolutely necessary, his actions always measured and deliberate. "Dominic wants to see you," Matteo said, his tone as neutral as ever. Now, she didn't hesitate. Something in his eyes told her this wasn't just a casual meeting. It was time. As they walked through the mansion, Matteo remained silent, his presence intimidating as always. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping an eye on her, waiting for her to slip up. They arrived at Dominic's office, and Matteo opened the door without a word. She stepped inside, and Dominic looked up from the papers on his desk. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her stomach churn. "Sit," he said, his voice calm but firm. She obeyed, taking a seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung in the air, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. "I know you've been working hard," he began, his gaze never leaving her. "And I know you've been uncovering the truth about what's going on. But I need to ask you something." She looked at him, unsure of what he was about to say. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What are you going to do with the information you've found?" Her heart raced. This was the moment of truth. She had been gathering evidence, but now Dominic was looking to her to make the decision. She took a deep breath and replied, "I'll expose them. I'll get them to confess and bring them to you." Dominic nodded slowly, his gaze never faltering. "I trust you," he said, "but I also know that there's a risk. If you're wrong, if you make the wrong move, it could cost us everything." She nodded in agreement. The pressure was mounting, and she knew that the stakes were higher than ever. She had no room for mistakes. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. "I'll handle it." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I'm counting on you," he said. "Don't let me down." As she left the office, she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. The entire family was relying on her now. The rebels were already planning their next move, and she had to act before it was too late. She couldn't afford to hesitate. That night, she made her plans. She would meet the conspirators, confront them, and expose them for the traitors they were. She would gather the evidence, force them into a confession, and deliver them to Dominic. The next morning, As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, she received a message. It was from Mateo, confirming the meeting. The time had come. She had no more time to waste. She put on her coat, checked the weapons she had hidden in her drawer, and set out to face the people who had been undermining everything Dominic had built. When she arrived at the designated meeting spot, a secluded warehouse on the edge of the property, she felt the tension in the air. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that tonight would change everything. The warehouse was dimly lit, shadows cast long across the floor as she stepped inside. There was a small group of men gathered in the center of the room, their faces hardened with suspicion. She recognized them immediately, the traitors, the men who had been leaking information to the rebels. They hadn't noticed her entrance. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "You've been betrayed," she said, her words sharp. The men turned toward her, their faces filled with shock. They weren't expecting her. They weren't expecting anyone to know the truth. But now they had nowhere to hide. The room grew tense, the air thick with tension. "You've been feeding information to the rebels," she continued, her voice steady. "And now it's time for you to answer for it." The men stood frozen, their eyes shifting nervously. They knew their time had come. It was no longer a question of what they wanted. It was about how far they were willing to go to protect themselves. And for the first time, she felt the full weight of the world she had entered. She was no longer just a part of the family's world. She was the one holding the power now. The confrontation in the warehouse was everything she had prepared for and more. The men, now cornered, exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had no way out. For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the tension that filled the space. She stood still, her gaze locked onto them, knowing that every word she said now would determine how far this would go. She had already made her decision. There was no turning back. "You've been feeding information to the rebels," she said, her voice steady. "And now, you're going to pay the price for your betrayal." One of the men, a man she had once considered an ally, stepped forward. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," he said, his voice shaking. "The family is bigger than any of us. You think Dominic's going to save you? You'll never make it out of this room alive." The threat was clear, and for a split second, fear flashed in her mind. But she quickly shook it off. She was no longer the maid who had stayed in the background. She had earned her place here, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. "I'm not the one who's in danger," she said, her voice cold. "You are." She could see the doubt in their eyes. They knew they were caught. The betrayal had been exposed, and there was no way out now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, sending a signal to Dominic's men, who had been waiting for the signal. Within seconds, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway, and Dominic's men rushed into the room, quickly subduing the traitors. It all happened so fast that the men didn't even have time to react. Within moments, they were bound and helpless, their plans unraveling before their eyes. She stepped back, watching as Dominic's men took control of the situation. It was over. The traitors were exposed, and Dominic's family was safe, for now. Dominic arrived moments later, his presence as commanding as ever. He walked into the room, his gaze sweeping over the captured men before settling on her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she could see the approval in his look. He walked toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. "You did well," he said, his voice low but carrying weight. "You've proven yourself." She nodded, trying to hide the relief that flooded through her. This was the moment she had been working for, the moment when everything had come together. She had done it. She had protected Dominic, and in doing so, she had secured her place in the family. But even as she stood there, her heart still racing from the intensity of the moment, she knew that this was only a temporary victory. The world she had entered was dangerous, and there would always be someone waiting for an opportunity to strike. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady but curious. Dominic's gaze softened just a fraction as he looked at her. "Now we rebuild," he said. "We've lost a few, but we've gained your loyalty. That's worth more than anything else." He turned to the men who had restrained the traitors and nodded. "Take them away," he said, his voice as final as ever. As the traitors were escorted out of the room, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, satisfaction, and perhaps something more, a sense of belonging. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone who had earned her place in this world, and she had proven it to everyone. But there was more work to be done. You'll continue your role in the organization, Dominic said, his voice commanding. But now, you're more than just a member. You're a leader, and you'll help shape the future of this family. The words hit her hard, more than she had expected. She had known she would have to prove herself, but this was different. She was being asked to lead, to guide others in a world where loyalty and trust were constantly tested. I'm ready, she said, her voice unwavering. Dominic nodded. I know you are. The next few days were a blur of meetings and decisions. As she stepped into her new role, she worked side by side with Dominic, learning from him, making decisions that would impact the future of the family. But even as she embraced her new position, she couldn't forget the lessons she had learned along the way. Trust was fragile. Loyalty was earned. And power, while it could be a tool, could also be a curse. As she sat in Dominic's office one evening, looking out at the city lights, she realized just how much she had changed. She had come a long way from the maid who had been falsely accused of theft, the woman who had been invisible in the background. Now, she was part of something bigger, and she was ready to protect it at any cost. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew she was prepared. The family was hers now, and she would do whatever it took to keep it safe. No one would ever undermine her or Dominic again.